That was the sentence that silenced the entire Sapphire Room in Manhattan. Richard Sterling, a hedge fund billionaire, known for destroying companies for sport, thought he was just humiliating a clumsy waitress. He thought Sarah was nobody. He saw the stained apron, the tired eyes, and the cheap shoes. He didn't see the woman who had negotiated treaties in war zones. He didn't see the person who held the key to his entire future. He threw the cash on the table, laughing, but 10 seconds later, the laughter stopped. The color drained from his face, and the most powerful man in New York did the one thing he never did. He froze in absolute terror. This is the story of how a simple waitress brought a billionaire to his knees without throwing a single punch. The Sapphire Room on 57th Street wasn't just a restaurant. It was an arena. It was the kind of place where a bottle of sparkling water cost $40, and the air smelled of truffle oil, old money, and desperation. If you were eating there, you had made it. If you were working there, you were invisible. Sarah Miller adjusted her apron in the reflection of the brass espresso machine. She looked tired. At 26, she had the kind of beauty that was hidden behind exhaustion, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back into a severe, practical bun, and hands that were dry from constant washing. Table 4 needs a refill on the Dom Perignon, the floor manager, Marcus, hissed as he walked by, snapping his fingers near her ear. And for God's sake, smile, Sarah. You look like a funeral. Yes, Marcus, she whispered. Sarah grabbed the chilled bottle of Dom Perignon P2, a vintage that cost more than her rent for the next 6 months. Her hands trembled slightly. Not from nerves, but from hunger. She hadn't eaten a full meal in 2 days. Every cent she made, every tip, every extra shift, was going to the mounting medical bills at St. Jude's Hospital. Her mother's heart surgery was scheduled for next Tuesday, and Sarah was still $4,000 short. She navigated the floor, dodging waiters carrying trays of caviar and Wagyu beef. She approached table 4, the loudest table in the restaurant. Sitting at the head was Richard Sterling. Everyone in New York knew Richard Sterling. He was the CEO of Sterling Vanguard, a private equity firm that specialized in hostile takeovers. He was 45, handsome in a predatory way, wearing a bespoke Brioni suit that cost $12,000. On his wrist sat a Patek Philippe Nautilus, platinum, catching the dim light of the chandeliers. He was currently holding court with 3 other men in suits and a woman named Jessica, a chaotic socialite wearing a red dress that was barely there. "So I told the zoning board," Richard boomed, his voice cutting through the ambient jazz. "I don't care if it's a historical landmark. If I want to build a helipad, I'm building a helipad. I bought the mayor. I can buy the bricks." The table erupted in sycophantic laughter. Jessica giggled, leaning onto his shoulder. "Oh, Richard, you're so bad." Sarah stepped up quietly, trying to be a ghost. "More champagne, sir?" Richard didn't look up. He waved his hand dismissively, nearly knocking the bottle out of her hand. "Just pour it. Don't ask." Sarah bit her lip. She expertly poured the golden liquid, twisting the bottle at the end to prevent a drip. But as she pulled back, Jessica, animated by a story she was telling, threw her arm out. Smack! Jessica's perfectly manicured hand hit Sarah's elbow. The bottle of Dom Perignon tilted. A splash, no more than a teaspoon, landed on the sleeve of Richard Sterling's suit. The table went silent. It wasn't a disaster. It was a few drops. But in Richard Sterling's world, imperfection was a capital offense. Richard looked at his sleeve. Then he looked at the bottle. Finally, he looked up at Sarah. His eyes were cold like shark skin. "Do you know what this is?" Richard asked, his voice dangerously low. I am so sorry, sir," Sarah stammered, grabbing a linen napkin. "Don't touch me," Richard barked, pulling his arm away. He stood up, towering over her. The entire restaurant seemed to pivot towards them. "This is vicuña wool. It's custom woven in Italy. This suit costs more than your entire life's earnings." "It was an accident, sir," Sarah pleaded, her face burning with humiliation. "The lady, she bumped my arm." "Blaming the guest?" Richard laughed, a cruel barking sound. He looked at his friends. "She spills champagne on me, and then she blames Jessica. Unbelievable. This is what happens when you let the riffraff handle 20-year-old wine. They don't respect quality because they've never tasted it." Marcus, the manager, materialized instantly, sweating. "Mr. Sterling, I am so sorry. Is everything all right? I can comp the meal. I don't want a free meal, Marcus," Richard sneered, wiping his sleeve. "I can buy this restaurant 5 times over before dessert. I want competence." He turned his eyes back to Sarah. She was looking at the floor, fighting back tears. She couldn't lose this job. Not with the surgery on Tuesday. "Look at me," Richard commanded. Sarah looked up. "You're pathetic," he said, smiling. It was a smile devoid of warmth. "You stand there, shaking, hoping I don't get you fired. You're wondering how you're going to pay your rent in Queens or the Bronx or wherever you people commute from." "I live in Brooklyn," Sarah said softly. "I didn't ask," Richard snapped. He sat back down, seemingly bored. "Get out of my sight. Send a real waiter." Sarah turned to leave, her heart pounding in her ears. She had taken abuse before, but this felt different. It was personal. She walked toward the kitchen, her eyes blurring. "Wait," Richard called out. She stopped. "Actually," Richard said, a new, wicked idea forming in his mind. He had spotted something near the entrance. A vendor had just walked in with a basket of flowers, trying to sell to the romantic couples before Marcus kicked her out. "Come back here." Sarah turned around slowly and walked back to table 4. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick stack of cash. It was wrapped in a purple band. Fresh $100 bills. He tossed the stack onto the white tablecloth with a heavy thud. "I'm bored," Richard announced to the table, "and when I'm bored, I like to gamble." He looked at Sarah. "You want to keep your job? You want a tip? I'm going to give you a chance to make more money in 5 minutes than you'll make in 5 years. Sarah looked at the money. It was at least $10,000. That was the surgery. That was rent. That was everything. "What do I have to do?" she asked, her voice steadying. Richard grinned. He pointed to the flower seller being escorted out by security near the door. "See those roses?" Richard asked. "Yes." "I want you to sell me a rose," Richard said, leaning back, swirling his wine. "But there's a catch. I just closed a deal in Dubai last week. I'm feeling cultural." Jessica giggled. "Richard, you don't speak Arabic." "I know a few words," Richard winked, enough to know what sounds pretty. He turned his gaze back to Sarah, his eyes gleaming with malice. He was setting her up. He knew she was just a waitress from Brooklyn. He knew she probably barely finished high school. He wanted to watch her struggle, stutter, and fail, so he could laugh at her desperation. "Sell me a rose," Richard said clearly. "But you have to do it in Arabic, flawless, poetic Arabic. If you can convince me to buy a rose in the language of the desert, I'll give you this stack. $10,000. Right now." The table went quiet. Even Jessica looked uncomfortable. "Richard, that's mean," one of the men said. "She obviously can't." "Hush," Richard hissed. "I want to see her try. I want to see how much dignity she's willing to lose for a paycheck." He looked at Sarah. "Well, go get a rose. Give us a show. Entertain us, peasant." The silence in the sapphire room stretched thin, tight as a violin string about to snap. Nearby diners had stopped eating. The humiliation was palpable. A billionaire taunting a waitress with a life-changing sum of money for a task he knew she couldn't perform. It was a modern-day gladiatorial game, and Sarah was the unarmed sacrifice. Sarah stared at the stack of money. $10,000. It was the difference between her mother living or dying. The surgery at St. Jude's required a specialized cardiac stent that insurance had refused to cover. The deposit was due in 48 hours. She looked at Richard Sterling. He was smirking, already turning to Jessica to make a joke about the texture of the scallops. He didn't think she would do it. He expected her to run away crying, or perhaps try to stumble through a salaam and look foolish. Sarah took a deep breath. She smoothed her apron. "One moment, sir," she said. She turned and walked toward the entrance. Marcus, the manager, intercepted her, his face red with panic. "Sarah, what are you doing? Just go to the kitchen. I'll handle him. Don't play his game. He's cruel." "I need the money, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly calm. "He's going to mock you. You don't know Arabic. You're from... Where are you from again? Ohio?" Sarah didn't answer. She walked past him to the elderly flower woman who was arguing with the security guard. "Excuse me," Sarah said. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her own tips from the night, maybe $40. "Can I buy a single red rose? The best one you have?" The woman looked at her, confused, but handed over a long-stemmed velvet red rose. "Keep the money, honey. You look like you're walking into a fire." "I am," Sarah murmured. She took the rose. She stripped the lower thorns with her fingernail, not wincing as one pricked her thumb. A tiny bead of blood appeared, but she wiped it away. She turned back to the dining room. The walk back to table 4 felt like walking the Green Mile. Every eye was on her. Some looked with pity, others with amusement. Richard Sterling saw her coming and clapped his hands mockingly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, raising his voice to the whole room, "the show begins. The Brooklyn Waitress is going to attempt the language of poets. This should be good for a laugh." Jessica pulled out her phone. "I have to record this for TikTok. Waitress fails hard." Sarah stopped at the edge of the table. She held the rose in both hands, clutching it against her chest. She looked at Richard. He wasn't just a bully. He was a symptom of a world that thought money was a substitute for character. He thought because she served him food, she was beneath him. He assumed that because she worked with her hands, she didn't use her mind. He didn't know about the dusty streets of Amman. He didn't know about the international school in Beirut. He didn't know about the nights she spent studying distinct dialects, while her father, the late Thomas Miller, served as the senior cultural attaché for the U.S. Embassy in the Middle East for 20 years. He didn't know that Sarah spoke 4 languages. He didn't know she had been accepted to the Sorbonne before her father's sudden heart attack and the subsequent freezing of their assets due to a complex, bureaucratic investigation that left them penniless. He saw a waitress. Sarah closed her eyes for a brief second, channeling the memories. The smell of cardamom coffee, the sound of the call to prayer echoing over the 7 hills of Amman, the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish she used to read to her father. She opened her eyes. The fatigue was gone. Her posture shifted. She didn't stand like a servant anymore. She stood like a diplomat. She stepped forward, her eyes locking onto Richard's. Richard leaned forward, grinning. "Go on then. Impress me. Say flower or something." Sarah didn't just say flower. She took a step closer, lowered the rose slightly, and began to speak. Her voice wasn't the timid whisper of the waitress from 5 minutes ago. It was resonant, guttural yet soft, carrying the distinct musical cadence of the Levant. Ya Sayyidi, she began. The room didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. It was commanding. Richard's smile faltered slightly. He expected gibberish. This sounded real. Sarah continued, her Arabic flawless, flowing like water over stones. She wasn't just selling a rose. She was reciting an impromptu poem, a traditional bargaining tactic used in the high souks of Damascus, but elevated to an art form. La tagaranka al-mazahir, fa inna al-warda, tanbutu bayna al-ashwak. Translation: Do not be deceived by appearances, for the rose grows between the thorns. She walked slowly around the table, not looking at anyone but Richard. She switched dialects slightly, moving into the Gulf Arabic that Richard claimed to know from his deal in Dubai, testing him. إنها ليست مجرد زهرة. إنها قلب ينبت بالعمل في أرض الياس. هل تستطيع شراء الجمال أم أنك تملك فقط ثمنه? Translation: It is not just a flower. It is a heart, beating with hope in the land of despair. Can you buy beauty, or do you only possess the price of it? She stopped right next to his ear. The restaurant was dead silent. Even the kitchen staff had come out to watch. Sarah placed the rose gently on the table, right next to the stack of money. Then, in English, she whispered, "That is how you sell a rose in Arabic, Mr. Sterling. It's not about the transaction. It's about the honor." She stood back, folding her hands. Richard sat there. His mouth was slightly open. His fork was hovering halfway to his mouth. Jessica had lowered her phone, forgetting to record. Richard blinked. He looked at his friends. He looked at the money. He looked at Sarah. For a moment, nobody moved. The arrogant billionaire had been stripped naked in front of his audience, not by insults, but by competence. "You," Richard started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat. "You memorized that. From a movie. That was just gibberish." He was trying to save face. He reached for the money, his hand hovering over the stack. "Nice trick. But that wasn't real Arabic. I know Arabic. That was nonsense." He was going to renege. He was going to gaslight her. "It wasn't nonsense." A deep voice boomed from the shadows of the corner booth behind them. Richard froze. He knew that voice. It was a voice he feared more than the SEC. A man stood up from the dimly lit table 1, the table reserved for VIPs, so exclusive they didn't want to be seen. He was an older man, wearing a thorb, traditional white robe, under a dark bespoke blazer, surrounded by 2 silent bodyguards. It was Sheikh Al Maktoum, the very investor Richard had claimed to close a deal with in Dubai, the man whose signature Richard needed to save his company from bankruptcy next week. The sheikh walked slowly toward Richard's table. He looked at Richard with utter contempt. Then he turned his warm, dark eyes toward Sarah. "It was not nonsense," the sheikh said, his British accent clipped and precise. "It was classic Levantine poetry. And her accent is better than yours, Richard. In fact, it is better than mine." The sheikh bowed his head slightly to Sarah. "Assalamu alaikum ya binti." "Peace be upon you, my daughter." Sarah bowed back, a reflex from a life she thought she had left behind. "Wa alaikumu assalam, ya sidi." Richard Sterling looked between them, his face turning the color of ash. He realized, with a sinking horror, that the simple waitress he had just mocked was the only person in the room whom the sheikh respected, and he had just declared war on her. The sapphire room was frozen in a tableau of shock. The clinking of silverware had ceased entirely. Richard Sterling, a man who controlled billions of dollars in assets, looked like a schoolboy caught cheating on an exam. Sheikh Al Maktoum stood by the table, his presence commanding a gravity that Richard's expensive suit could never achieve. The sheikh did not look at Richard. He looked at Sarah. "You have the dialect of the Sham region," the sheikh observed, his voice low and cultured. "But there is a specific cadence to it. Diplomatic. Precise. Who taught you?" Sarah swallowed hard. Her hands were still trembling, not from fear of Richard anymore, but from the sudden, overwhelming proximity to a past she had buried. "My father, Your Highness," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "Thomas Miller." The sheikh's eyes widened slightly. The recognition was instant. He stepped closer, ignoring the boundaries of personal space that waiters were supposed to maintain. "Thomas Miller, the cultural attaché, the man who brokered the peace of the Jordan Valley?" "Yes, sir," Sarah whispered. "Allah yarhamu, may God have mercy on him," the sheikh said softly, placing a hand over his heart. "He was a good man, a lion in a world of jackals. I dined at your house in Ammon when you were just a child. You sat under the table, listening to us discuss oil treaties." "I remember," Sarah said, a faint smile touching her lips. "You always brought dates from Medina." Richard Sterling stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The sound was jarring, breaking the moment. He couldn't stand being ignored. He couldn't stand that his peasant waitress was currently sharing a moment of intimacy with the man who held the fate of Sterling Vanguard in his hands. "Your Highness," Richard interrupted, his smile tight and frantic. "I see you've met our help. It's a small world, isn't it? But we have the merger to discuss. The paperwork is ready. I have the private room prepared upstairs." The sheikh turned his head slowly to look at Richard. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by the cold indifference of a monarch. "Richard," the sheikh said, "you told me earlier that you spoke Arabic. You said you understood the culture. I know the basics," Richard stammered. "Business terms, greetings." "Yet," the sheikh pointed to Sarah, "you mocked this woman. You challenged her. You bet $10,000 that she could not speak the language." The sheikh looked down at the stack of cash still sitting on the table next to the rose. "The bet was made, Richard," the sheikh said, his voice hardening. "A gentleman honors his debts. A king honors his word. Which one are you?" Richard looked at the money. It was agonizing for him. Not because of the amount, 10,000 was pocket change to him, but because of what it represented. Submission. "It was a joke, Your Highness." Richard tried to laugh, but it came out as a dry croak. "We were just having fun with the staff." "Pay her," the sheikh commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. Richard's jaw tightened. He could feel the eyes of Jessica and his business partners on him. He could feel the eyes of the entire restaurant. He reached out, his hand shaking with suppressed rage, and pushed the stack of bills toward Sarah. "Here," Richard spat. "Buy yourself something nice, maybe a new apron." Sarah didn't flinch. She reached out and took the money. She didn't count it. She didn't gloat. She simply placed it in the deep pocket of her apron. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," she said coolly. "This will cover the cardiac stent my mother needs on Tuesday. You've just saved a life." She turned to walk away, intending to clock out, grab her bag, and run to the hospital before Richard could find a way to fire her or have her arrested. "Wait," the sheikh said. Sarah stopped. "Where are you going, Miss Miller?" "To the kitchen, Your Highness. I have tables to serve." "No," the sheikh shook his head. "I do not think you do." He turned to Richard. "Richard, my translator, Mr. Haddad, is currently stuck in traffic near the Holland Tunnel. He will not make it for our dinner." Richard's eyes lit up. This was his chance to regain control. "No problem, Your Highness. I speak enough English for both of us, and my lawyers. I do not trust your lawyers, Richard," the sheikh cut him off. and I do not trust your English when it comes to the fine print of a $4 billion acquisition." The sheikh gestured to the empty chair next to him. "Miss Miller will join us," the sheikh declared. "She will be my translator for the evening. I trust her father's blood. And I trust anyone who can sell a rose with poetry." Richard looked like he was about to have a stroke. "Your Highness, surely." "She's a waitress. She's wearing a uniform. It's highly irregular." "Then buy her a dress," the sheikh said, sitting down at Richard's table. "Or she can sit as she is. I do not care about the silk, Richard. I care about the truth. Sit down, Sarah." Sarah looked at Marcus, the manager, who was hovering nearby, looking terrified. He gave her a frantic nod that clearly meant, "Do whatever he says, or we are all dead." Sarah pulled out the chair opposite Richard Sterling. 10 minutes ago, she was serving him champagne. Now, she was the gatekeeper to his fortune. She sat down. She kept her back straight. She placed her hands on the table. "I am at your service, Your Highness," she said. Richard stared at her across the candlelit table. His eyes promised retribution. "You think you've won," his look said. "But when he leaves, I will destroy you." Sarah met his gaze. She touched the pocket of her apron where the money sat. She wasn't afraid anymore. The dinner was a surreal torture for Richard Sterling. The staff brought out course after course: bluefin tuna tartare, truffle risotto, wagyu beef, dishes that Sarah had carried 1,000 times but never tasted. Now she was eating them, using the silverware she usually polished. The conversation had shifted to business, specifically the acquisition of a massive tech infrastructure firm in Dubai that Sterling Vanguard wanted to buy. The deal was complex, involving international zoning laws, liquidity assets, and government oversight. Richard was in his element now. He spoke fast, using aggressive corporate jargon, trying to steamroll the conversation. "Tell His Highness that the liquidity variance is only temporary," Richard said, leaning forward, sweat beading on his forehead. "Tell him the Series B funding is locked." Sarah turned to the sheikh. She didn't just translate the words, she translated the tone. "Ya Sayyidi," Sarah said in Arabic. "He claims the money is secure, but he uses the word variance. In finance, this usually implies a gap he is trying to cover with debt. He is nervous." The sheikh nodded slowly, sipping his tea. He looked at Richard. "I understand. Continue." Richard didn't know what Sarah had said, but he didn't like the way the sheikh was looking at him. "And tell him," Richard continued, "that the zoning rights for the port expansion are fully guaranteed by the local municipality. I have the contracts right here." Richard slid a thick blue folder across the table. It was the closer, the document that would seal the deal. "This is the master agreement," Richard said, tapping the leather cover. "Standard boilerplate. I just need his signature on page 42, and we can transfer the initial investment of $500 million tonight." The sheikh looked at the folder. He didn't open it. He pushed it towards Sarah. "Read it, Sarah," the sheikh said. "Sir, it's legal jargon," Richard scoffed. "She's a waitress. She won't understand." "Her father wrote the trade agreements between Jordan and Israel," the sheikh said calmly. "I think she can handle a real estate contract. Read it." Sarah opened the folder. The text was dense, single-spaced, full of legal clauses and sub-clauses. But Sarah had spent years helping her father review documents. She knew how to scan for the poison pills, the hidden traps lawyers buried in the footnotes. The table was silent as she read. Richard watched her, tapping his Patek Philippe watch. He was arrogant. He thought he was smarter than everyone in the room. He had buried the trap deep on page 38, section C, paragraph 4. Sarah turned the pages. 10, 20, 30. She paused. Her finger stopped on page 38. She read the paragraph twice. Her eyes narrowed. She looked up at Richard. He winked at her. It was a subtle, greasy wink. A silent bribe. Let it slide, and I'll make it worth your while. Sarah looked at the sheikh, the man who had honored her father, the man who treated her with dignity. Then she looked at the $10,000 in her pocket. If she ruined this deal, Richard Sterling would hunt her down. He would blacklist her from every job in the city. He might even find a way to sue her. But if she let it slide, the sheikh, a man of honor, would lose millions. "What is it?" the sheikh asked. "Is it standard?" Sarah took a breath. "Mr. Sterling," Sarah said, in English, her voice ringing clear. "Can you explain Section C, Paragraph 4, the force majeure clause?" Richard froze. His face went pale. "It's standard liability protection, Sarah. Just read it to him." "It's not standard," Sarah said, looking directly at the sheikh. "Your Highness, do not sign this." "Why?" the sheikh asked. "Richard." Sarah switched to English so the whole table could hear, including Richard's horrified partners. "You have redefined force majeure in this contract to include regulatory restructuring, meaning if the Dubai government changes a single zoning law, which they are scheduled to do next month, you can pull out all your funding, keep the sheikh's initial deposit of $500 million, and walk away with the assets without paying a dime." Gasps went around the table. Jessica covered her mouth. Richard stood up, knocking his chair over. "You lying little? She doesn't know what she's talking about. She's uneducated trash." "Sit down, Richard," the sheikh barked. The command cracked like a whip. The sheikh looked at Sarah. "Is this true? Show me." Sarah pointed to the line. "Here, sir. Regulatory restructuring event. It essentially makes the contract voidable at his discretion while retaining the non-refundable deposit." The sheikh put on his reading glasses. He had them all along. He read the line. He closed the folder. He looked at Richard Sterling with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You tried to steal $500 million from me," the sheikh said quietly, "in front of my face." "It's a misunderstanding," Richard cried, sweat pouring down his face. "My lawyers. It's a draft. It's the wrong version." "You called her a peasant," the sheikh said, standing up. "You mocked her poverty. You threw money at her like she was an animal. And yet, she has more honor in her little finger than you have in your entire empire." The sheikh signaled to his bodyguards. "The deal is off, Richard. Sterling Vanguard will not see a penny of my money. And tomorrow morning, I will be calling my associates at BlackRock and Vanguard. I will tell them exactly what kind of standard contracts you write." Richard looked like he had been shot. Losing the sheikh was bad. Being blacklisted by the global investment community was a death sentence. "No, please," Richard begged, reaching out. "Your Highness, we can fix this." "Sarah, tell him it's a mistake." Richard turned to Sarah, his eyes wild with desperation. "Sarah, please, I'll give you anything. I'll give you $100,000. Just tell him you misread it." Sarah stood up slowly. She smoothed her apron. "I can't do that, Mr. Sterling," she said. "My father taught me that some things are not for sale." She looked at the sheikh. "Will there be anything else, Your Highness?" "No, my child," the sheikh smiled warmly. "You have done enough, but please take my card. Call my office tomorrow. You are wasting your talents pouring wine for fools." The sheikh turned and walked out of the restaurant, his entourage trailing behind him. Sarah was left standing at the table with a ruined billionaire. Richard Sterling slumped into his chair, head in his hands. His friends were already backing away, checking their phones, distancing themselves from the sinking ship. Jessica had vanished. Richard looked up at Sarah. His eyes were red, hollow. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of reality. "You realize what you've done?" he whispered hoarsely. "You just destroyed me." "No, Richard," Sarah said, picking up the empty tray from the side stand. "You destroyed yourself. I just sold you a rose." She turned and walked toward the kitchen. But the story wasn't over. As Sarah pushed through the swinging doors into the noisy, chaotic sanctuary of the kitchen, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt heavy. She touched the cash in her pocket. She had the money for her mother. She had saved the sheikh. But she knew men like Richard Sterling. They didn't just lose and walk away. They got even. As she walked to the locker room to change, her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. She picked it up. "You think you're a hero?" a voice hissed. It wasn't Richard. It was deeper, distorted. "You just cost the wrong people a lot of money, Miss Miller. Richard was just the front man. You should have taken the tip and kept your mouth shut." The line went dead. Sarah stood in the locker room, the cold air biting her skin. She looked at the mirror. The waitress was gone. The diplomat's daughter was back, and she had just walked into a war zone. The subway ride from Manhattan to Brooklyn usually lulled Sarah into a state of numbness. The rhythmic clacking of the tracks was the soundtrack of her exhaustion. But tonight, the train car felt like a cage. Every time the doors opened, Sarah flinched. She clutched her bag against her chest. Inside, wrapped in a linen napkin inside a Ziploc bag, was the $10,000. The threatening phone call echoed in her mind. "You just cost the wrong people a lot of money." Richard Sterling was a bully, but he was a loud, visible bully. He operated in the daylight. The voice on the phone was different. It was calm, precise, and devoid of ego. It sounded like the kind of voice that ordered drone strikes or dissolved pension funds. Sarah got off at the Atlantic Avenue station. She didn't go home. She went straight to St. Jude's Hospital. The fluorescent lights of the hospital lobby hummed with an antiseptic anxiety. Sarah marched to the billing department. The night clerk, a kindly woman named Mrs. Higgins, looked up over her spectacles. "Sarah, honey." Mrs. Higgins smiled, though her eyes were tired. "You're late tonight. Visiting hours are over." "I'm not here to visit," Sarah said, breathless. She pulled the thick envelope of cash out of her bag and slid it under the glass partition. "This is for the cardiac stent. The deposit, $10,000. Mrs. Higgins blinked, looking at the cash. "My goodness. Sarah, where did you—" "Tips," Sarah lied quickly. "Just a really good night. Please process it now. I want the surgery confirmed for Tuesday morning." Mrs. Higgins nodded, sensing the urgency. She began counting the bills. The machine whirred. 1,000, 2,000. Sarah watched the door. She felt exposed. "All right," Mrs. Higgins said, typing into her computer. "Account updated. Paid in full. The scheduling team will—" Mrs. Higgins stopped. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. A frown deepened the lines on her forehead. "That's odd," she muttered. "What?" Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. "The system," Mrs. Higgins said, tapping the enter key repeatedly. "It's locked. It says, 'Account under administrative review.'" "Review?" Sarah leaned into the glass. "What review? I just paid you." "I don't know," Mrs. Higgins said, looking confused. "This flag wasn't here an hour ago. It says, 'Pending insurance fraud investigation.' Sarah, did you change providers?" "No," Sarah cried. "We don't even have providers. We're paying cash." "I can't schedule the surgery while the account is flagged," Mrs. Higgins said, her voice sympathetic but firm. "You'll have to talk to the legal department in the morning." Sarah stepped back, the room spinning. Insurance fraud. It was a lie, a bureaucratic weapon. The phone in her pocket buzzed again. Same unknown number. Sarah stared at it. Her hands shook. She answered. Hello? The hospital system is very sensitive, isn't it? The voice said. It's amazing how a single anonymous tip about suspicious funding sources can freeze an account. Who are you? Sarah whispered, gripping the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. Go outside, Sarah. There is a black Lincoln Town car at the curb. Get in. If you run, the administrative review becomes a police investigation, and your mother doesn't get surgery in prison. Sarah hung up. She looked toward the elevators where her mother was sleeping on the 4th floor. She had the money, but money was useless against the system. She turned and walked out the automatic doors into the cool night air. The black Lincoln was there, idling like a dark shark in the water. The back window rolled down. Sitting inside wasn't a thug, it was a woman. She was in her 50s, wearing a sharp grey power suit, her silver hair cut in a ruthless bob. She looked like a senator, or perhaps a headmistress of a very expensive boarding school. Get in, Sarah, the woman said. It's cold. Sarah opened the door and sat. The locks clicked shut instantly. I'm Eleanor Vance, the woman said, not offering a hand. I represent the board of directors that oversees Sterling Vanguard. Richard works for me, or rather, he did, until you neutered him over an appetizer. He tried to cheat Sheikh Al Maktoum, Sarah said, her diplomat training kicking in. Don't show fear. Show facts. Richard is a blunt instrument, Eleanor sighed, opening a tablet. He writes bad contracts. That force majeure clause was clumsy. But the deal was essential. The shadow investor you're worried about. That's us. That's the pension fund of half the police force in New York. That's the endowment of this hospital. Sarah froze. You fund the hospital? We own the debt, Eleanor corrected, which gives us influence. Eleanor turned to look at Sarah. Her eyes were like flint. You cost us $4 billion tonight, Sarah, and you humiliated our front man. But I'm a pragmatist. I don't want revenge. I want the deal. The sheikh walked away, Sarah said. Because of you, Eleanor countered, which means you are the only one who can bring him back. I'm a waitress? No, Eleanor leaned closer. You're Thomas Miller's daughter. You speak the language. The sheikh respects you. Here is the offer. Eleanor held up a single file folder. Tomorrow morning, you will call the sheikh's office using the card he gave you. You will request a meeting. You will tell him that you made a mistake. You will tell him that you mistranslated the contract due to nerves. You will take the fall. You want me to lie, Sarah said, to a man who values honor above everything. If you do, Eleanor continued, ignoring the moral objection, I will lift the flag on your mother's account. I will pay for the surgery myself, and I will wire an additional $200,000 into an offshore account for you. And if I don't? Eleanor didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply looked bored. Then the fraud investigation proceeds. Your mother is discharged tomorrow due to liability concerns. And I will make sure that every restaurant in New York knows that Sarah Miller steals silverware. The car stopped. They were back at the subway station. You have until 9 Utamatud a.m., Eleanor said. Get out. Sarah didn't sleep. She sat in her small apartment in Brooklyn, staring at the business card of Sheikh Al Maktoum. Gold embossed, heavy cardstock, a direct line. It was 4 a.m. She was under siege. It wasn't a siege of soldiers, but a siege of paperwork and influence. Eleanor Vance held all the cards. She could kill Sarah's mother without ever touching a weapon. Sarah thought about her father. Thomas Miller had died of a heart attack in a hotel room in Geneva, right in the middle of a peace negotiation. He had died broke because he refused to take bribes. He refused to smooth over the rough edges of treaties for oil companies. "Integrity is expensive, Sarah," he used to tell her. "That is why so few people can afford it." Sarah looked at her mother's photo on the mantel. Her mother, who had worked 2 jobs to put Sarah through the Sorbonne before the money ran out. Her mother, who was currently lying in a hospital bed, her heart failing. If Sarah lied to the sheikh, she saved her mother. But she would destroy the one thing she had left. Her name. She would become exactly what Richard Sterling thought she was. Someone who could be bought. But if she didn't lie, her mother would die. It was an impossible choice. At 7 a.m., Sarah showered and dressed. She didn't put on her waitress uniform. She put on her only suit, a charcoal blazer she wore to job interviews. She pulled her hair back. She applied lipstick. She wasn't going to call the sheikh. She wasn't going to call Eleanor. She was going to go to war. Sarah took the subway into the city. She didn't go to the hospital. She went to the prestigious law offices of Harrow and Associates on Wall Street. She didn't have an appointment. She didn't have money for a retainer. But she knew something Eleanor Vance didn't know. She walked up to the receptionist. "I need to see David Harrow. Now." The receptionist laughed. "Mr. Harrow is the managing partner. He doesn't see walk-ins." "Tell him Thomas Miller's daughter is here," Sarah said. "And tell him I know about Geneva." The receptionist hesitated. The name Thomas Miller meant nothing to her, but the tone of Sarah's voice made her pause. She picked up the phone. 2 minutes later, Sarah was ushered into a corner office overlooking the harbour. David Harrow, a man in his 60s with a mane of white hair, stood up from his desk. He looked shocked. "Little Sarah?" he asked. "My God, it's been 10 years." David Harrow had been her father's best friend. He was also the executor of her father's estate, an estate that had been drained by legal fees defending Thomas's reputation after he died. "I don't have time for pleasantries, Uncle David," Sarah said, using the childhood nickname. She sat down. "I need you to represent me." "Represent you? In what?" "In a whistleblower negotiation against Sterling Vanguard and their parent company, the Apex Group." David's face went pale. "Apex? Sarah, those are dangerous people. Eleanor Vance eats lawyers for breakfast." "She's blackmailing me," Sarah said. "She's holding my mother's healthcare hostage to force me to lie to Sheikh Al Maktoum. She wants me to facilitate a fraud." Sarah laid it all out. The dinner, the contract, the threats, the hospital flag. David rubbed his temples. "Sarah, this is ugly. Eleanor can bury you. Even if we sue, it will take months. Your mother doesn't have months." "I know," Sarah said. "That's why we aren't going to sue. We're going to counter-leverage." "With what?" Sarah reached into her bag. She didn't pull out money. She pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It was old, worn, and smelled of pipe tobacco. It was her father's diary from Geneva. "Eleanor Vance mentioned the shadow investor," Sarah said. She admitted they owned the debt of the hospital. She admitted to influence peddling. But she doesn't know that my father was investigating Apex 10 years ago before he died. David looked at the notebook. He never published those findings. He said it was too dangerous. "Because he had a daughter to protect," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "Well, I'm not a child anymore, and I have nothing left to lose." She opened the diary to a marked page. "Here," she pointed. "Apex was laundering money through the very infrastructure projects in Dubai that Richard Sterling is trying to buy." The sheikh doesn't just need to know about a bad contract clause. He needs to know he's about to get into bed with a money laundering operation that has been sanctioned by the UN. David read the page. His eyes widened. This is nuclear, Sarah. If this gets out, Apex doesn't just lose the deal. They face federal indictment. Exactly, Sarah said. I don't want to leak it. I want to trade it. Trade it for what? My mother's life. Sarah stood up. Call Eleanor Vance. Tell her to meet us. Not at a dark corner and not in an office. Tell her to meet us at the Sapphire Room at noon. Neutral ground. David looked at Sarah with a mixture of fear and awe. You're really his daughter, aren't you? Make the call, Sarah said. 12 p.m. The Sapphire Room. The restaurant was empty, preparing for the lunch rush. Sarah sat at table 4, the same table where she had poured champagne the night before. This time she wasn't wearing an apron. She was sitting at the head of the table. David Harrow sat to her right. The doors opened. Eleanor Vance walked in, flanked by 2 lawyers in suits. She looked annoyed. This is theatrical, Sarah, Eleanor said, dropping her bag on a chair. Mr. Harrow, I'm surprised you came out of semi-retirement for a waitress. She's a client, David said smoothly. And we have a counter-offer. I gave you my offer, Eleanor snapped. Call the sheikh, fix the deal, or your mother is transferred to a county facility by 5 p.m. We aren't calling the sheikh, Sarah said. Eleanor laughed dryly. Then this meeting is over. She turned to leave. If you walk out that door, Sarah said, her voice projecting clearly across the room, Mr. Harrow will email a PDF of my father's Geneva journals to the SEC, the FBI, and Sheikh Al Maktoum directly. Eleanor stopped. She turned around slowly. The boredom was gone from her face. What did you say? Geneva, 2015, Sarah said. Project Oasis. I know about the laundering, Eleanor. I know Apex isn't just an investment firm. It's a washing machine for sanctioned money. The room went deadly silent. The 2 lawyers behind Eleanor exchanged nervous glances. You're bluffing, Eleanor whispered. Thomas Miller died broke. He didn't have evidence. Sarah slid the leather notebook across the table. Read page 114. It has the account numbers. It has the names. Eleanor walked back to the table. She didn't touch the book. She just looked at it like it was a bomb. If you hurt my mother, Sarah said, leaning forward, I burn your entire company to the ground. I will destroy Richard. I will destroy you, and I will destroy the fund. Eleanor stared at Sarah. For the first time, the shadow investor looked unsettled. She realized she had made a fatal error. She had assumed Sarah was poor and therefore weak. She forgot that information was the only currency that mattered. What do you want? Eleanor asked, her voice tight. 1, Sarah listed. You unfreeze my mother's account immediately. 2, you cover the entire cost of her surgery and recovery. VIP suite. Top surgeons. Done, Eleanor said instantly. What else? 3, Sarah said. Richard Sterling resigns. Today. Publicly. He's my best earner, Eleanor protested. He's a liability, Sarah countered. And he insulted me. Eleanor grit her teeth. Fine, Richard is out. Is that it? No, Sarah said. She stood up. I want my job back. Eleanor blinked. Excuse me? You have leverage to ask for millions and you want to wait tables. I don't want to wait tables, Sarah smiled. I want to run this place, the Sapphire Room. You own the debt, which means you own the restaurant. I want to be the general manager, with a salary that matches. You have no experience, Eleanor scoffed. I handled a billionaire, a sheikh, and a corporate shark in 24 hours, Sarah said. I think I can handle the dinner rush. Eleanor looked at the notebook, then at Sarah. She pulled out her phone. "I'm making the call to the hospital," Eleanor said. "You have your deal." Sarah let out a breath she had been holding for 10 years. But just as Eleanor dialed, the doors of the restaurant burst open. It wasn't customers. It was Sheikh Al Maktoum. And he wasn't alone. He was with 4 NYPD officers. "Nobody move!" an officer shouted. The sheikh walked straight toward the table. He didn't look happy. "Did you think," the sheikh boomed, his voice echoing off the walls, "that I would not do my own research?" He looked at Sarah, then at Eleanor. "My security team traced the threat against Miss Miller," the sheikh said. "And we traced the interference at the hospital. This is not just business anymore, Mrs. Vance. This is extortion." Sarah looked at David. "This wasn't part of the plan, Sarah," the sheikh said, his face softening as he looked at her. "You should have called me immediately. You did not need to blackmail these vipers. You only needed to ask." The police moved toward Eleanor. "Eleanor Vance," the officer said. "We have a warrant for your arrest for wire fraud and attempted extortion." As the handcuffs clicked onto Eleanor's wrists, she looked at Sarah with pure hatred. "This isn't over," Eleanor spat. "It is for you," Sarah said quietly. The sheikh walked up to Sarah. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You fought bravely," he said, "like your father. But you are done fighting alone." He looked around the restaurant. "I am buying this building," the sheikh announced, "and I am looking for a partner to run my American operations, someone who speaks the language, someone who cannot be bought." He extended a hand to Sarah. "What do you say, partner?" The arrest of Eleanor Vance was swift and quiet, the way things happen when powerful men decide to clean house. As the police cars pulled away, the sheikh turned to Sarah. "Your mother's surgery has been transferred to the private wing," he said softly. "My personal physicians are flying in from London to oversee the procedure. It is already paid for." Sarah felt the strength finally leave her legs. She sat down on the nearest chair, burying her face in her hands. She wept, not from sadness, but from the sheer release of a burden she had carried alone for 10 years. 3 months later, the Sapphire Room had changed. It was no longer a cold arena for Wall Street sharks to flash their wealth. Under the new ownership of the Al Maktoum Group and the management of Sarah Miller, it had become a place of culture. The stiff white tablecloths were replaced with warm linens. The music was no longer generic jazz, but a curated mix of global sounds. And the staff? They were no longer invisible. Sarah had fired Marcus, not for his fear, but for his lack of leadership, and promoted the elderly flower seller to be the restaurant's official florist, greeting guests with fresh blooms every evening. On a rainy Tuesday night, Sarah sat in her glass-walled office overlooking the dining floor. She wore a tailored navy suit, not an apron. On her desk sat a photo of her mother, who was currently recovering in a cottage in the Hamptons, healthy and smiling. A commotion at the front desk caught Sarah's eye. She stood up and walked to the balcony. Down below, a man was arguing with the new maitre d'. It was Richard Sterling. He looked different. The Brioni suit was gone, replaced by a rumpled jacket that looked a size too big. He looked older, greyer. Since the scandal with the force majeure clause and the subsequent investigation into Apex, Richard had been toxic. He had lost his CEO position, his reputation, and his friends. "I just want a table," Richard was saying, his voice shrill. "I used to eat here 3 times a week. Do you know who I am?" "We know who you are, Mr. Sterling," the maitre d' said politely. "That is why we cannot seat you. We have a strict policy regarding abusive behavior toward staff." Richard looked up. He saw Sarah standing on the balcony. Their eyes locked. For a moment, Richard looked like he might shout or beg or rage, but then he saw the way she stood, not with arrogance, but with absolute peace. He saw the rose in a crystal vase on her desk behind her. He realized then that he hadn't just lost a bet. He had lost his place in the world because he forgot how to treat the people who served him. Richard lowered his head. He turned around and walked out into the rain, disappearing into the city that no longer cared about his name. Sarah watched him go. She touched the rose on her desk. La tagaranka al-mazahir, she whispered to herself. Do not be deceived by appearances. She turned back to her work. She had a restaurant to run. And that is how Sarah Miller went from clearing tables to owning the room. It's a powerful reminder that true worth isn't found in a bank account, a designer suit, or a VIP table. Richard Sterling thought his money gave him the right to treat people like dirt, but he forgot the most important rule of life. The toes you step on today might be attached to the foot that kicks you out tomorrow. Sarah proved that dignity, intelligence, and integrity are currencies that never devalue. She didn't just win a bet, she won her life back because she stayed true to who she was, even when the world tried to make her feel small. If this story moved you, or if you've ever had to smile through the pain while doing a hard job, please hit that like button. It helps us share these stories with more people. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of karmic justice. And tell me in the comments, have you ever seen an arrogant person get what they deserved? I'd love to hear your story. Thanks for watching, and stay strong.